means to be willing to change your way of living. You may have no power to do it. You may not have power to give up some of those habits you know are wrong. You may not have power to...
For decades, Billy Graham was more than just a preacher. He was a force of nature. A man who filled stadiums, met with presidents, and preached to over 200 million people across the world. To many, he was the face of faith in the 20th century, a calm, humble messenger of hope. But behind the polished smile, powerful sermons, and worldwide fame, there were sides of Billy Graham that very few ever knew. Strange stories, hidden habits, and unexpected beliefs that reveal a far more complex man than most imagined. While history remembers him as America's pastor, Graham's life was full of contradictions and fascinating details. He was deeply spiritual, but also surprisingly superstitious. He was a man of faith, yet he faced moments of doubt so strong they nearly ended his ministry. He was close to the most powerful people in the world, from Queen Elizabeth to Richard Nixon. But his influence came with moral struggles that tested his character again and again. There were unusual routines he followed before every crusade, private letters he never wanted released, and even a moment where he almost gave up preaching forever. And when you hear what he confessed in his final years, it might just change the way you see him, because the truth is, Billy Graham wasn't just a preacher. He was a human being with secrets, fears, and quirks that most of his followers never saw. And once you discover these strange facts, you'll realize that the man behind the pulpit lived a life far more mysterious and more human than anyone ever expected. Long before the world knew the name Billy Graham, he was just a restless farm boy growing up in the rolling fields of North Carolina. Born in 1918, Billy wasn't the saintly image people would later associate with him. In fact, as a teenager, he was more interested in baseball and mischief than in the Bible. His parents were devout, but young Billy often found church long and dull. He once admitted that he'd rather be anywhere but in a pew. It's strange to think that the man who would one day fill stadiums with sermons once struggled to stay awake in Sunday school. But something began to stir in him when he turned 16. It wasn't a sudden burst of holiness or a divine voice. It was something simpler, even strange. A traveling preacher named Mordecai Ham came to town for a revival meeting. Billy didn't want to go. He thought those events were dramatic and over the top. Yet his friend convinced him to attend one night, and as he sat in the crowd, something shifted. He later said it felt like a fire burning deep inside, a feeling he couldn't explain. He went home that night and couldn't sleep. That experience, he said, turned my rebellion into reflection. Still, few people know that Billy almost gave up on becoming a preacher before he even began. When he enrolled at Bob Jones College, he was told by his professors that he wasn't cut out for ministry. They said his preaching lacked emotion and power. Imagine that. The man who would one day become the most famous evangelist in the world was told he wasn't good enough to preach. It hurt him deeply, and he considered quitting altogether. But fate had other plans. He transferred to Florida Bible Institute, where something remarkable happened. Billy developed a strange habit that would stay with him for life. He would wander into the woods alone and practice preaching to the trees and birds. He'd stand on rocks and pretend the trees were his audience, his Bible in hand, his voice echoing through the empty forest. Neighbors often thought he was odd, maybe even eccentric. But Billy later said those lonely moments were when he first felt connected to God. Another little-known fact is that Billy struggled with stage fright. In his early days, whenever he stood in front of a crowd, his hands would tremble and his voice would shake. Once during a sermon in college, he became so nervous that he lost his place in the Bible and simply walked off stage. Yet instead of being embarrassed, he used that failure as motivation. He prayed every night asking God to give him strength, not for fame, but for courage. When he finally found his footing as a preacher, he didn't plan on becoming a global figure. His only dream was to spread a message of faith to whoever would listen. But something about his voice, his sincerity, and his energy began to draw people in. By his mid-20s, crowds were showing up just to hear the tall farm boy with fire in his voice. Still, even then, there was something unusual about him. Unlike many young preachers, Billy wasn't driven by money or status. He lived simply, often turning down offers that would have made him wealthy. He once told a friend, "If I start living for comfort, I'll stop living for purpose. That humble, almost obsessive dedication to simplicity would define him for decades. He refused luxury, avoided gossip, and even created what he called the Modesto Manifesto, a set of strict personal rules meant to keep him honest. Among them were vows to never be alone with a woman who wasn't his wife, to never handle church money directly, and to always avoid exaggerating the size of his crowds. Those principles made him different, even strange, in the eyes of many other religious leaders. But to Billy, it was the only way to stay pure in a world full of temptation. From a boy who couldn't sit through church to a man who would reshape modern faith, Billy Graham's beginnings were anything but ordinary. And as he would soon discover, his journey to fame would uncover even more strange twists, including a friendship with a U.S. president that would test everything he believed in. By the late 1940s, Billy Graham was no longer just a local preacher, he was becoming a national voice. What began as small revival meetings in tents and school gyms suddenly grew into massive gatherings that filled stadiums across America. His energy, charisma, and clear message drew people by the thousands. But with fame came something Billy never expected: power and the strange influence that came with it. One of the most surprising parts of his story is just how deeply connected he became to world leaders. By the 1950s, Billy Graham wasn't just preaching to ordinary people. He was sitting across from presidents, kings, and queens. He advised every U.S. president from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, an achievement no other preacher in American history can claim. But what many don't know is that his first meeting with a president almost ended his political influence before it began. When Billy met President Truman in 1950, he was young, enthusiastic, and perhaps a bit naive. After their meeting, reporters surrounded him outside the White House. Billy, excited by the moment, shared every detail of the private conversation and even reenacted how they knelt together to pray. Truman was furious. He felt Graham had violated his trust. For years afterward, the two didn't speak. That early mistake taught Billy an important lesson about discretion, one that shaped his relationships with future presidents. By the time Dwight Eisenhower came to power, Billy had learned how to balance faith and influence. Eisenhower often invited him to pray at official events and even sought his counsel before launching key speeches. Later, with Lyndon B. Johnson, Graham became almost like a family friend, visiting the ranch in Texas, sitting in meetings, and praying with him during the darkest moments of the Vietnam War. But it was his friendship with Richard Nixon that remains one of the strangest and most controversial chapters of his life. The two men shared a bond built on patriotism and faith. Nixon admired Graham's ability to inspire people, while Billy respected Nixon's intellect and drive. The preacher became a regular guest at the White House, even helping Nixon craft speeches that included spiritual language. But when the Watergate scandal erupted, that friendship came back to haunt him. Tapes from the Nixon White House later revealed private conversations where Graham was heard making remarks that shocked the public. Though he later apologized deeply for the comments, the scandal left a mark on his reputation. It was one of the few times in his life when the world saw that even Billy Graham, the man so many saw as flawless, was capable of missteps. Despite the controversy, Graham never allowed politics to consume him. He distanced himself from partisanship and publicly declared that his true loyalty was to his faith, not any political party. "I will never again make the gospel serve politics," he once said. "The gospel is above all earthly kingdoms." Another strange but fascinating fact: Billy Graham turned down personal wealth at nearly every turn. Publishers, sponsors, and networks offered him millions to commercialize his sermons or endorse products. He refused every single one. Instead, he drew a modest salary from his organization and donated most of his book royalties to charity. His financial transparency was almost unheard of in an era when televangelists were often accused of greed. Yet what truly made Graham unique was his global reach. His crusades took him to over 180 countries, often under extraordinary circumstances. In 1982, he preached in the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, a move that stunned both American politicians and religious leaders. Critics accused him of being manipulated by the Soviet regime, but Graham insisted he went there to share faith, not politics. "You don't change hearts with threats," he said. "You change them with truth." Throughout it all, there was a strange duality to Billy Graham's life. A man of deep humility who often stood beside the world's most powerful people. He called presidents friends, yet lived in a modest North Carolina home and drove his own car until late in life. His rise from a small-town preacher to a global figure was nothing short of extraordinary. But behind that, in his private journals, Billy often wrote about the crushing weight of his mission. He was preaching to crowds of tens of thousands, traveling constantly and shouldering the moral expectations of an entire generation. "Sometimes," he wrote, "I feel like a man standing on a mountain, shouting to the world while my own soul trembles beneath me." That sentence alone reveals more about him than any sermon could, a preacher who inspired others while wrestling with his own weakness. One of the strangest facts about Billy Graham was his almost obsessive discipline. To avoid even the appearance of scandal, he created a list of personal commandments long before it was common for public figures to do so. The most famous of these was part of what he called the Modesto Manifesto. Among its rules were strict guidelines. He would never meet a woman alone in a room, never travel without a trusted colleague, never handle donations personally, and never stay in a hotel without accountability. He even had his staff sweep his hotel rooms before he entered, not for safety, but to make sure no one could stage a compromising photo. These habits may sound extreme, but they came from fear, not of people, but of falling short. Billy had seen other preachers lose everything to scandal, and he knew one rumor could destroy decades of work. His routines became his armor. Another strange part of his personality was his deep superstition before every crusade. Despite being a man of logic and faith, Billy always carried the same worn-out Bible to every event, refusing to replace it no matter how fragile it became. He believed that its presence reminded him of his humble beginnings. Before walking on stage, he often knelt in silence and touched the cover, whispering, "Not me, Lord, you." His aides said he would never go out to preach without that moment of quiet surrender, no matter how large the crowd or how tight the schedule. But even with all his preparation and faith, Billy sometimes doubted himself and even God. In his later years, he openly admitted that he'd wrestled with questions about heaven, hell, and salvation. "There were nights," he said, "when I lay awake wondering, am I really doing what God wants or what people expect of me?" Those were dangerous thoughts for a man idolized by millions. Yet rather than hiding his doubts, Billy used them to grow stronger, often preaching that faith without doubt is like a body without breath. Still, the price of his calling was high. His wife, Ruth, once said that she had been a single mother married to a world evangelist. Billy was away for months, sometimes years, traveling from one crusade to another. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, and the simple joys of family life. His children loved him deeply, but even they admitted there were long stretches when he was just a voice on the phone. Franklin Graham, his son, later said, "I didn't get to know my father until I was grown." It's strange to imagine the world's most famous preacher feeling lonely, but Billy often confessed that he did. "I preached to millions," he once said, "but sometimes I came home to silence." That loneliness made him depend even more on his faith, and on his wife Ruth, who became the emotional anchor that held him steady through decades of travel and temptation. There were also physical struggles. Years of nonstop speaking, constant travel, and limited rest took a toll on his body. He suffered insomnia, exhaustion, and eventually Parkinson's disease. Yet even when his health declined, he refused to retire completely. "As long as I can whisper," he said, "I'll whisper God's word." The more you look at Billy Graham's life, the more you realize that his greatness didn't come from being perfect. It came from his ability to stay humble in his imperfections. His strange rules, his doubts, his relentless discipline, all of it formed the man who became a symbol of faith in a skeptical world. And in his final years, As his strength faded and the crowds disappeared, Billy Graham made one last confession that surprised everyone. A truth about his life, his regrets, and what he wished he'd done differently. As Billy Graham entered his final years, the world began to see a quieter, more reflective side of the man who had once filled entire stadiums with his voice. The booming preacher who once stood before millions was now a fragile figure, living in a modest home in the mountains of North Carolina, surrounded by silence and memories. His health had begun to fail. Parkinson's disease had slowed his movements, his eyesight faded, and his once powerful voice was reduced to a soft whisper. But even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp and his heart full of faith. In those years of stillness, Billy did something he had rarely done before. He looked back. Decades of ministry, thousands of sermons, and countless souls had passed before him, and now he began to ask himself what it had all meant. In one of his final interviews, he said softly, "If I could live my life again, I would spend less time preaching and more time being with my family." It was a rare confession from a man who had dedicated his entire existence to spreading the gospel. He had no regrets about serving God, but he deeply regretted the moments he missed with Ruth and their children. "I've preached to millions," he once told a friend, "but the greatest congregation I ever had was sitting around my dinner table. And I wasn't there enough." It was a haunting thought for a man who had always tried to do the right thing. Ruth Graham, his wife of over 60 years, had passed away in 2007, and her absence left a quiet ache in his heart that never healed. She had been his balance, his counselor, and the one person unafraid to challenge him. "When I was praised too much," he said, "she reminded me I was still just a sinner saved by grace." In his final decade, Billy often visited her grave, sitting in silence for hours. His staff recalled that sometimes he'd whisper, "I'm ready to go home." Yet even in frailty, Billy continued to touch lives. When he could no longer travel, he recorded short messages from his home, brief reflections on faith, forgiveness, and the brevity of life. One of his most moving statements came in a video called "My Hope America." In it, he said, "I've preached in stadiums, but now my heart longs to preach from my chair, to tell you that God loves you more than you can imagine." That video reached millions online, proving that even in old age, his influence was timeless. But there was one final revelation that surprised even his closest followers. In an interview near the end of his life, Graham admitted that he was not as certain about everything as people thought. "I don't have all the answers," he said quietly. "There are mysteries in God's plan that I can't explain, and that's all right. Faith means trusting even when you don't understand." For a man who had spent his life giving answers, this humility was astonishing and beautiful. Billy also revealed his hope for the church's future. He warned against pride, division, and political manipulation, things he had seen corrupt faith communities in his lifetime. "The gospel doesn't belong to any party or flag," he said. "It belongs to the cross." Those words became his parting message to a world often more divided than faithful. When Billy Graham passed away on February 21, 2018, at the age of 99, the world mourned not just a preacher, but an era. His body lay in honor in the U.S. Capitol, only the fourth private citizen in history to receive that tribute. Presidents, world leaders, and ordinary people came together to pay respects to a man who had somehow reached across politics, races, and generations with a single, unwavering message: hope. In his hometown, church bells rang softly. Thousands lined the roads as his motorcade passed. There were no golden carriages, no extravagance, just a simple wooden casket made by inmates from the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Billy had requested it himself years before. "I came into this world with nothing," he said, "and I'll leave it the same way." Perhaps the strangest fact of all about Billy Graham isn't about his fame, his connections, or even his sermons. It's how deeply human he remained through it all. He lived with humility, admitted his doubts, guarded his integrity, and left behind not wealth or power, but a legacy of faith that continues to echo through generations, And as one of his final recorded messages declared, "When you hear that Billy Graham is dead, don't believe it for a second. I will be more alive than ever. I will just have changed my address." A fitting farewell from a man who spent his life preparing for home.